Hello, friend. Welcome back to Deep Slumber History. Settle in, find the softest part of your pillow, let the weight of the day slide off your shoulders, and let your hands come to rest. There is nothing left to do tonight, nothing to fix, nothing to answer, nothing that cannot wait until a morning that is still a long, long way off. Just this quiet hour, and a slow story to carry you gently down into sleep. Tonight, we're going somewhere you already think you know. You've seen it 1,000 times. The swinging saloon doors, the dusty street at high noon, the lone rider against a wide and golden sky. The American West, the frontier. It lives in our imagination as a kind of grand and simple painting. Brave men, hard land, a clean and lonely sort of freedom. But the West of the films is a costume, stitched together long after the fact and sold back to us as history. Underneath it was a real place, where real people woke each morning in the cold and the dark and simply lived. And the ordinary things they lived with, the small, unremarkable things that not one of them ever thought twice about, would be enough tonight to turn a modern stomach. That is what we're here for. Not the legend, the real thing. The medicine they spooned into their children to help them sleep. The water they drank from a shared and swinging cup. The beds they climbed into beside snoring strangers. The food that came out of the tin, the whiskey that came out of the barrel, the small, strange, everyday details the storybooks so quietly leave out. None of it was hidden in its day. All of it was perfectly, thoroughly normal. That is the strangest part of all, and I think the most oddly comforting once you let it be. Before we begin, if these slow journeys into the past help you drift off, it would mean a great deal if you subscribed. It's a small thing, and it genuinely helps these quiet stories find other people lying awake tonight, in other dark rooms, looking for exactly this. And if you'd like, once you've settled, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you are and what hour it is where you're listening. I read every one, usually late, once my own house has gone quiet. It's a nice thing to think of us all scattered out there in the dark together. But there's no hurry about any of that. There's no hurry about anything at all now. So, are you comfortable? Is the light low, the room warm, the blanket pulled up just the way you like it? Good. That's all you need to do tonight. The rest is mine. Let the year fall away. Let it be 1875. A rutted main street of hard-packed dirt, running through a small frontier town set down somewhere between nowhere and further nowhere. A scatter of false-fronted buildings under an enormous darkening sky. The heat of the day is lifting off the boards. The lamps are being lit, one by one, against the coming night. And behind every lamplit window, in every warm and ordinary room, something perfectly normal and quietly, gently disturbing is taking place. Let's step inside. There's no need to knock. No one out here locks a door. We begin where the trouble so often began, with a tired mother and a child who would not sleep. Her name, let us say, is Ada. She's 24 years old and looks a good deal older, the way frontier women so often did, worn smooth and thin by wind and work and worry. It is long past midnight, and she has been awake for the better part of 2 nights running. Her youngest, a boy not yet 2, with a damp curl of hair stuck to his forehead, is fretful and warm and miserable, cutting a back tooth, and he has been crying on and off since the sun went down. She has walked him, she has rocked him, she has tried every small quiet thing a mother knows to try, and none of it has held for longer than a few minutes. And so at last she rises in the dark, lays the boy in his cradle, crosses the cold plank floor in her bare feet, and reaches up to the shelf for the small brown bottle that nearly every household on the frontier kept close at hand. The label promises peace. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, it reads, in kind and careful lettering, curling and old-fashioned, for children teething. There is a picture on it of a mother and a contented rosy child, the very image of a quiet nursery at rest. Ada has used it before. Her own mother used it before her, back east. Every woman she knows keeps a bottle. She uncorks it, and there is that faintly sweet medicinal smell, and she measures out a small, careful spoonful, exactly as the label instructs, and she tips it past the boy's lips. He makes a face, and swallows, and fusses. And then, truly within minutes, he begins to soften. The crying trails off into a few hiccuping breaths. His clenched little fists come open, his eyelids grow heavy and droop and close, His breathing slows and deepens and evens out into the long, slow rhythm of a deep and untroubled sleep. And Ada, weak with relief, lays her head down and at last sleeps too. What she does not know, what almost no one in that whole town would have thought to ask, is that the gentle syrup she has just spooned into her infant son is a solution of morphine, one of the most powerful opiates known to medicine, dissolved in sweetened water, poured into a pretty bottle with a smiling baby on the label, and set out on an open shelf at the general store, between the sacks of coffee and the bolts of calico for anyone at all to buy. No prescription, no pharmacist, no questions asked, and no answers offered. A mother could buy it as easily as she bought a paper of pins. It was, everyone agreed, a wonderful thing. And the reason everyone agreed was very simple. It worked. Here is the part that is hardest to hold in the mind, lying here in our own soft and careful age. This was not some dark secret, whispered between desperate parents behind closed doors. There was no shame in it, because there was no knowledge of it. It was simply how a good mother cared for a teething child. The frontier had few doctors, and fewer still that a poor family could afford or reach, and so the general store was the pharmacy, the surgery, and the apothecary all at once. And its shelves were lined, top to bottom, with bottles and tins and paper packets that would empty a modern chemist's shop in a single, long afternoon of arrests. Mrs. Winslow's was only the most famous of them. There was Godfrey's cordial, another opium preparation, so widely given to infants that in some places it was known plainly as mother's friend. There were teething powders and colic drops and quieting syrups by the dozen, nearly all of them built on the same soft foundation of opium or morphine, and nearly all of them aimed, by name and by picture, squarely at children. In the crowded tenements and the mining camps and the sod houses, working mothers with too much to do and too many little ones underfoot would dose the babies into sleep so that the work could go on. And here and there, quietly, a child who was dosed a little too generously simply did not wake again. It was written down, when it was written down at all, as a natural death, a weak constitution, God's will. No one connected the small brown bottle to the small still cradle, because the bottle was a comfort, and comforts do not kill. And it was not only the children, there was laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, dark and bitter, taken by grown men and women for coughs, for cramps, for aching teeth, for sleeplessness, for grief, for what they gently called a woman's nerves. A few drops for almost anything that ailed you, and a few more when the first drops wore thin. There was cocaine, sold openly in tonics and lozenges, and toothache drops made especially for children, promised on the label to bring an instantaneous cure. And there was morphine itself, which had come home from the Great War a decade before in the very veins of tens of thousands of soldiers, men dosed on the battlefield and in the hospital tents until the need never left them. There were so many of them, wandering home hollow-eyed and hungry for the needle, that the country invented a soft and forgiving name for what had happened to them. They called it the soldier's disease, the way you might name a bad habit rather than a chain, and so, quietly, in farmhouses and boarding rooms and dugouts all across the West, a great many perfectly ordinary people were dependent, unknowing, unashamed, and entirely unremarkable. The rancher's wife with her afternoon tonic, the shopkeeper with his nightly drops, the old man whose cough syrup he could no longer do without, the baby dosed to sleep so his mother could finally close her own burning eyes. Not one of them thought of themselves as anything but ordinary, because there was no word for it yet that carried any weight, and no law that stood in the way, and no voice anywhere telling them that the kind bottle on the shelf was anything other than exactly what it claimed to be. It would be decades before any of this changed. It would take until 1906, 30 years after our little town's lamplit night, before a law would finally require that a bottle so much as list what was inside it, that the word morphine, or opium, or cocaine appear anywhere at all on that pretty label. Until then, the label said soothing, and the mothers believed it because it was true. It did soothe. It soothed beautifully. That was the whole of the trouble. Picture Ada again then, asleep at last in the grey and silent hour before dawn, her boy quiet and warm in his cradle beside her, the little brown bottle back on its shelf with the cork pressed gently into place. She has done nothing that any soul in that town would call wrong. She has done exactly, precisely what a good and loving mother was meant to do. And that, more than any outlaw, more than any gunfight, more than any of the loud and famous dangers of the age, is the truly unsettling thing about the Old West, not the wickedness of it, the ordinariness of it. How the danger sat quietly on the shelf, in kind and careful lettering, beside the coffee and the flour, wishing you and your children a good night's rest. Let the bottle go now. Let Ada sleep. She has earned it, poor soul, and we will not trouble her again for a while, because when the sun comes up over our little town, there is somewhere else we need to be, a chair by the window of the barber shop where a man is already waiting, with an ache in his jaw and not the faintest idea in the world of what the morning has in store for his teeth. But that is the next part of our story, and there is no hurry at all. Let the night pass first. Let it be, for a little while, simply dark and quiet and still. Morning then. The light comes up grey, and then rose, and then a hard, clean gold over the false-fronted buildings, and the town begins, slowly, to stir. A rooster somewhere down the street, a door on a dry hinge, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting on the cool air, and under it, always, the warm animal smell of horses and dust that was simply what the whole world smelled like then. And on the main street, beneath a striped pole turning slowly on its spindle in the morning breeze, a barber is unlocking his door and propping it open to the day. We think of the barber as the gentlest of professions, a shave, a trim, a little easy talk, a hot towel laid over a tired face. But on the frontier, and for a great many long centuries before it, the man with the razor was a good deal more than that. He was, very often, the closest thing a small town had to a surgeon. That striped pole itself, turning red and white outside his window, is older and darker than it looks. The red was for blood, and the white for the bandage, a sign hung out from the days, not so very long past, when the barber and the surgeon were one and the same man, and the pole he displayed was meant to call to mind the bound and bleeding arm of a patient beneath his blade. In a settled eastern city, that old arrangement had mostly faded. But out here, a long hard way from any proper doctor, it had never entirely gone away. So when a cowhand named Elias comes through the propped-open door this morning, grey-faced and holding one hand pressed to the side of his jaw, he has not come for a shave. He has a tooth, a back molar, that has been aching for the better part of a week and has now become something a great deal worse than an ache. A hot, throbbing, sickening thing, swollen so that the whole side of his face has begun to puff, that has kept him from sleeping and from chewing on that side, and this morning from thinking about much of anything else. And the barber, drying his hands on his apron and taking one look at the poor man's face, simply nods, because he has seen this 100 times and he knows exactly what has to be done. There is no dentist, of course. The nearest is a 2-day ride, if there is one at all, and there is, of course, no anaesthetic, nothing to dull the pain, nothing to send a man gently to sleep while the work is done. What there is a bottle of whiskey kept on the shelf for exactly this purpose. Elias is told to take a long pull of it, and then another, and to keep the bottle in his hand. And that whiskey and a strong grip and a few kind words, is the whole of the mercy available to him on this earth this morning. The barber selects an instrument from a roll of them, a thing that looks a little like a pair of pliers and a little like something you might use on a horse's hoof. He tips Elias's head back against the chair, he sets his feet, he takes a firm hold, and he pulls. I will spare you the sound of it. You already know the sound of it, somewhere deep in the animal part of you, and there is no need to dwell there tonight. And here is the strange, quiet horror of the thing. This was not thought of as barbaric. Not at all. This was thought of as help. This was the good and sensible option, the reasonable thing, the thing a level-headed man did when a tooth went bad, and Elias would have counted himself lucky to have a barber steady enough to do it well, because the alternative was worse than the pulling. The alternative was to leave it and let the infection spread. And infection, in a world with not one antibiotic anywhere in it, was one of the great quiet killers of the entire age. A bad tooth, an infected gum, could poison the blood and take a strong young man down into fever and death over the slow course of a week or two, and everyone had known someone it happened to. So the barber's chair, for all its terror, was the safe choice. It was the wise choice. Elias, pulling from the bottle with his eyes streaming, was doing the smart thing, and the barber was hardly the darkest of the frontier's rough medicine. There were older tools still on his shelf and older ideas behind them. Bloodletting had not entirely died out. The notion that a body could be relieved of illness by relieving it of some of its blood Opening a vein or setting cups against the skin to draw it, a practice thousands of years old and just then slowly on its way out. Out on the ranches and the trail, where there was no barber and no doctor at all, men were their own surgeons. They set their own broken bones, pulling the ends straight by main force and binding them to a splintered board. They stitched their own long wounds with a needle and whatever thread was near. And when a bullet needed to come out, and out here it sometimes did, a man would go looking for it with the point of a knife and the probe of a finger, an unwashed finger. For no one yet understood that the invisible thing that so often killed the patient a few days later, the fever and the swelling and the terrible sweet rot, was riding in on the very hands that were trying to help. They packed their wounds with whatever came to hand and seemed sensible. Cobwebs, chewing tobacco, axle grease, a poultice of flour, a handful of soil. And they believed, quite sincerely and quite universally, that a healing wound ought to fill with thick yellow matter. They had a name for it. They called it laudable pus, laudable, worthy of praise, and they took its appearance as the welcome sign that the body was mending, when in fact, as often as not, it was the first sure signal of the infection that was about to carry the patient off. They were not fools. I want you to hold on to that drifting off because it matters. They were not stupid, and they were not careless. They were simply living in the very last long moment before the world understood germs at all. Before anyone alive knew that the enemy was not bad air or bad blood or an imbalance of ancient humours or ill luck, but something far too small to see, carried in on hands and knives and unwashed cloth. They did everything right, by every scrap of knowledge they had been given. And a great many of them died of it anyway, gently and bewildered, wondering to the last what they could possibly have done wrong. Elias, though, Elias will be fine. He's one of the lucky ones. He spits and swears and takes another long, grateful pull of the whiskey and presses a rag to the raw and bleeding gap, and by evening the terrible pounding pressure in his jaw is simply, blessedly gone. Gone, for the first time in a week. He feels, on the whole, that the barber has done him a very great kindness. And by the standards of 1875 the barber truly has. He lays a few coins on the counter and touches his hat and steps back out into the bright and dusty street, running his tongue slowly over the new soft gap, tasting blood and whiskey, and he thinks no more about it. It is done. It is behind him. That was simply what happened when a tooth went bad. Let him go, our lucky Elias, blinking in the sun. Let us follow the street a little further along, down toward the centre of the town, where a well has been dug in the open ground, and a barrel stands beside it in the shade. Because everyone in this town drinks from that well, every soul of them, all day long, and not one of them has the faintest idea of what is truly in the water. Water. It ought to be the simplest thing in all the world. It ought to be the safe thing, the clean thing, the one plain mercy a thirsty person could always count on. On the frontier, it was very often the most dangerous thing you would touch in the whole of your day. Come with me to the centre of our little town, to the open patch of ground where the well was dug when the settlement was young. There is a barrel beside it, standing in a slice of shade, and a single tin cup, a dipper with a long handle, hangs from a little chain, so that anyone passing, anyone thirsty and dusty from the road, may draw a drink and be refreshed. It is a kind arrangement, a neighbourly one, the sort of small decency a young town is proud of. And that same dipper is lifted all day long and into the night to the lips of every living soul who passes through. The trail-worn stranger with the road still in his throat, the feverish child, the old man with the wet and rattling cough, the drunkard weaving home from the saloon, one after another after another after another, and each of them drinks, and each of them hangs the wet cup back on its little chain, and not one of them washes it. It would not so much as occur to anyone to wash it. Why on earth would you wash a cup? It is only water. It is just the town dipper. It has always hung there. And the well itself, dug by hand, in a hurry, in the town's first hungry season, when there was no time to think carefully about where, sits a good deal closer than anyone likes to imagine to the privies out behind the buildings, and to the muddy pen where the animals are kept, and to the ground where the wash-water and the slop are thrown. So that when the rains come, and the ground grows soft and heavy, what is in the soil moves. It moves slowly and silently and invisibly, down and sideways through the earth, into the water table, into the well, and no one can see it. No one can smell it or taste it. The water comes up clear and cold and sweet from the dark, and everyone drinks, and everyone is grateful, and the sickness that follows is blamed on anything at all except the well. This is the reason the true great killers of the frontier were so seldom the ones we put in the songs and the films. It was not, for the most part, the gun. The gun killed men here and there, loudly, memorably. But the quiet things killed far, far more. It was cholera, which could take a strong, healthy man from his first uneasy cramp to his cold grave inside a single day. One day, dawn to dark, that fast. It was typhoid and dysentery, the bloody flux, what they called almost tenderly the summer complaint, which crept through the wagon camps and the boom towns and the crowded army forts and emptied them out in the hot months. On the great overland trails west, cholera killed so relentlessly that the ruts of the wagon roads were lined, for mile upon weary mile, with the shallow graves of the dead. The emigrants learned a terrible grim rhythm. Travel with the sick through the day, bury them at dusk where they fell, and move on again at dawn, because the land did not stop being hard and the season did not stop turning, just because you had lost someone. There was nothing else to be done, so they buried, and they walked on, and they tried not to look back at the small raw mounds falling behind them in the grass. And the water out on the trail carried its own separate trap, one that had nothing to do with the tiny living things in the well. Out on the alkali flats of the dry country, the still pools that gathered and gleamed looked, from a distance, like the answer to a traveller's prayers. But they were laced with mineral salts leached out of the poisoned ground, and they tasted faintly of soap, and they could sicken and kill the very oxen and horses that drank from them, and the people too, wringing them out with cramps and worse. The wise old hands learned to distrust any water that lay too still, that tasted too soft, that showed a white encrusted rim at its edges. But wisdom did not always arrive in a man before thirst did, out in that country, and thirst is a poor counsellor. Which brings us gently to the small strange answer to a question you may never have known you had. The reason that everyone in these old stories seems forever to be drinking coffee, or whiskey, or weak beer, from the moment they wake to the moment they sleep. We tend to imagine it was simple hardness or vice, or the wildness of the times. It was nothing of the kind. It was that these things were safe, and the water so often was not. The coffee had been boiled, hard, over a fire, and boiling, though they did not know why, killed the invisible things that killed them. The beer and the whiskey had been brewed or distilled, cut through with alcohol that the tiny killers could not survive. And so, without one soul understanding the true reason, a body of hard-won folk wisdom had grown up around the plain fact that a man who drank his coffee and his beer and left the well alone tended somehow to keep his feet, while the sober, sensible man beside him, drinking his clear cold water like a Christian, sickened and sometimes died. They did not know about the cholera in the dipper. They only knew from long and sorrowful experience which drinks tended to leave a man standing at the end of a bad summer. There was one killer stranger still, out in the new broken country, and it is the kind of thing you would swear someone invented for a story. In certain regions, cattle that grazed on a particular white-flowered plant called snakeroot took a poison up into their bodies and passed it on, invisibly, into their milk. And the families who drank that milk, trusting it, giving it to their children, fell ill with a wasting, trembling, deadly sickness they called the milk sickness, or the milk fever, and could not for the life of them understand. Whole settlements were abandoned because of it. It is widely believed to be the thing that killed the mother of a boy named Abraham Lincoln, out on the Indiana frontier, when he was 9 years old, a poisoned glass of milk from a gentle cow on an ordinary day. That is the frontier in a single image. The danger was never where you were looking. It was in the milk, and the water, and the kind cup on its chain. So the dipper swings gently there in the shade, catching the afternoon light, offered freely and warmly to every dusty stranger who passes, the friendliest and the most quietly murderous object in the whole of the town. Take nothing from it. Come away, back into the lengthening shadows of the street. The afternoon is wearing on now toward evening, and you have been on the road a long time today, and you're going to need a place to lay your head tonight, which turns out on the frontier to be its own peculiar adventure entirely. Night comes down over the plains the way it only ever does out there, enormous and complete, the dark seeming to rise up out of the ground itself as the stars come crowding in overhead by the 1,000, by the 10,000, more stars than a city person ever sees in a lifetime, and you, a traveller with the dust of the whole day in your collar and a deep ache set into your back, go looking, in the last of the light, for a bed. You find a boarding house or a hotel, though hotel is a generous and hopeful word for the 2-story frame building you step into. You pay over your coins to a tired man behind a plank counter, and you are told your number, and you are shown up a narrow stair that creaks under every boot. And here is the first thing you must understand about sleep on the frontier. The thing that our own soft private age has forgotten so thoroughly it sounds almost made up. Very often, you are not renting a room. You are not, on the crowded nights, even renting a bed. You are renting half of one. In the boom towns, the mining camps that swelled overnight, the railheads, the cattle towns at the end of the season, men poured in far faster than beds could ever be built for them, and a bed, in such a place, was far too valuable a thing to squander on a single sleeper. So you paid your 2 bits, and you were led to a bed that already held a stranger. Some other tired man, a miner still gritty from his claim, a drover, a drifter, a fellow traveller as road-worn as yourself. And you lay down beside him, back to back, boots off and not much else, and pulled your share of the blanket, and that was simply that. No introductions, no apology. That was what 2 bits bought. And on the busiest nights, in the hungriest towns, the beds themselves were run in shifts, run like the mine was run, in 8-hour turns around the clock. A man coming off his shift would climb the stairs and lie down in the warm hollow that another man had just that moment risen from, to go down and take his place at the diggings. The sheets, if there were sheets at all, were not changed between one warm body and the next. There was no time for it, and no thought of it, and no earthly reason anyone could see to bother. They called it, with the flat frontier humour that named everything so plainly, a hot bed. A bed that never had the chance to go cold, passed from man to man to man, warm as a nest, all the day and all the night around. And you were never, ever truly alone in that bed, not for one moment. The straw tick beneath you, for the mattress was very often a rough sack stuffed with straw or corn husks, and the grey blanket over you, and the very walls and floorboards around you, were alive. Bedbugs, which the frontier knew with a helpless and bitter intimacy, came out in the warm dark in their patient thousands, up out of every seam and crack and fed. Fleas, brought in on the dogs and the men and the very dust, and lice, body lice, the small grey travellers that the soldiers of the late war had come to call greybacks, passed man to man in exactly these shared and sheetless and shiftless beds, an unwelcome guest that once settled was near impossible to be rid of. To lie down in a frontier boarding house was to be quietly and thoroughly fed upon, all night long, by a great and tireless host of small hungry things, and to wake in the grey morning marked all over with bites, and to scratch, and to think almost nothing of it. Because everyone woke that way, everyone was bitten. It was simply another thing the night contained, like the cold and the snoring and the smell. People developed toward all of it a grim, practical, weary sort of relationship. They knew which itch was a flea and which was a bug. They knew the particular sour smell of a room that had gone bad, and a wise traveller learned to sniff the air and check the seams of the tick by candlelight before he committed his weary bones to it, though on most nights there was no other bed to be had for miles, and so he lay down anyway. They dragged their mattresses out into the hard sun when they could, and beat them, because sun and air and beating were nearly the only weapons anyone had, and they told each other, the way people do about a shared misery they cannot escape, that a little of it kept a man humble, and that you slept sounder for being tired enough not to care. What they did not have, what they could not even really imagine wanting, was the thing you are lying in right now. A clean, private, quiet, empty bed, with fresh sheets and a door that shuts, all of it yours alone. That ordinary modern miracle would have struck a frontier traveller as an absurd and princely extravagance, the sort of soft foolishness only a rich fool would waste good money on. So settle in then, beside your snoring stranger, in your paid-for half of the warm and living bed, under the vast and freezing prairie dark that presses in at the one small window. He has paid the same 2 bits you have. Neither of you will speak a word. Neither of you will learn the other's name. By morning he'll be gone, off down the road, or down the mine, and someone else will have taken his place in the hollow, and the bed itself, this patient, crowded, humble bed, will never once, in all its long, hard-working life, be empty or cold or clean. But you are tired. You are so very tired, and the tiredness is its own kind of mercy, the road's one gift, and it pulls you down past all of it into sleep. Let the night pass over the both of you. In the morning we will see about some breakfast, though I will warn you now gently that you may rather wish we hadn't. There is one single problem that shaped very nearly everything about how the frontier ate, and it is a simple one to state, and it changes everything once you hold it in your mind. There was no cold, no ice through most of the year in most of the places people lived, no refrigeration of any kind. That miracle was still generations off. No reliable way, once the winter's ice had melted from the icehouse, to keep a perishable thing from turning. Fresh meat began to go the moment the animal was killed. Fresh milk soured in a matter of hours in the summer heat. Fresh anything was a fleeting, local, seasonal luxury, gone almost as soon as it arrived. And so the entire everyday frontier diet was built, out of hard and constant necessity, around foods that had been preserved to the very outermost edge of edibility, and very often a good deal past it. There was salt pork, the great staple, which was mostly fat and salt, and would keep more or less forever in its barrel of brine, and which a family might eat, fried or boiled or stirred into beans, at very nearly every meal for months on end without variety or complaint. There was hardtack, a flour and water biscuit baked so ruthlessly hard that it had to be soaked soft, or dunked in coffee, or frankly broken with the butt of a rifle before a human tooth dared meet it, and which was so reliably, so dependably full of weevils and their little larvae that the soldiers and teamsters who lived on it learned simply to eat it in the dark, where a man could not see what he was chewing, or to soak it in hot coffee and quietly skim off the small pale things that floated up to the top and think no more about the rest. There was flour that had gone to weevils in the barrel and been sifted and baked and eaten regardless. There was butter gone rancid and salted heavily to disguise the turn, and eggs of an age that a careful cook simply did not inquire into too closely, and dried fruit that came with its own small livestock. This was not the food of the poorest and most wretched. This was ordinary food, on an ordinary table in a decent hard-working home, and then there were the tins, the airtights, as the frontier called all canned goods with real affection, which had arrived out west as something close to a genuine miracle, and rightly so. Peaches, tomatoes, oysters, condensed milk, sweet and thick, corn and beans and sardines. Bright summer food sealed up out of season and carried 1,000 jolting miles by wagon and rail, to be opened in the dead of a plains winter, a little taste of somewhere green and easy. The airtights were beloved and prized, and a can of peaches was a real and remembered treat. But the cans of that early era were sealed by hand with lead solder, the seams run with molten lead along their length, and that lead leached slowly and silently and tastelessly into whatever sat inside against it, especially anything acid, anything like tomatoes or fruit. So that the very tins that so cleverly kept the food from rotting were, all the while, adding a slow, soft poison of their own. A little more with every month the can sat on the shelf, and a can that had gone bad within, one that bulged or hissed or smelled wrong on opening, was very often simply eaten anyway, because it had been carried so far and cost so dear that to throw it out was unthinkable, and the terrible creeping sickness that sometimes followed was laid at the door of bad air, or bad luck, or the eater's own weak stomach. No one yet had a name for what was really in the swollen tin. Nor could a person trust that a food was even the thing it claimed on the label to be. This was a world entirely without inspection, without honest labelling, without any law anywhere compelling a seller to tell the smallest truth about what he sold. And in the absence of any such law, the adulteration of food was not an occasional crime, but a settled and ordinary business practice, worked into the price of everything. Flour was stretched with ground chalk, with powdered gypsum, with plaster of Paris, with ground-up bone, to make the barrel go further. Milk, in the growing cities the frontier traded with, was watered thin and then whitened back to a wholesome colour with chalk, or with far worse, and thickened to a creamy look with things a mother would faint to hear named. Coffee, sold ground, was bulked out with roasted acorns, with chicory, with burnt beans and baked earth. Candy for the children, bright, cheerful, penny candy, was coloured with dyes drawn from copper and lead, and, God help them, arsenic, brilliant greens and deep reds that we now know for the frank poisons they were. Pickles were greened with copper to make them look fresh. Tea leaves were used, dried, dyed, and sold again. You bought what you were sold, and you carried it home, and you fed it to the people you loved, and you hoped, and there was no one, anywhere in that whole wide country, whose actual paid job it was to stand between you and the merchant's heavy thumb pressing down on the scale. Picture the cook, then, in the boarding house where we passed the night, a broad and tired woman, up in the black cold long before anyone else, working over a smoking iron stove by lamplight. She is not careless. She is, by every standard of her own world, a good and thrifty and even a proud cook, coaxing something like a real meal out of salt pork and weevilly flour, and a dented tin of tomatoes and a bucket of water drawn from that same central well. She skims the weevils from the flour without a flicker of thought, the way you would brush a crumb from a table. She cuts away the part of the meat that has gone too far past saving, and cooks the rest of it hard and long to be safe. She sets it down hot and plentiful, and she would be honestly baffled, and more than a little insulted to be told there was one single thing wrong with any of it. In her world there is not. She has done everything right, and her boarders eat every bite and mop the plate and thank her kindly, and push back from the table satisfied and go out to face their day. Because it was food, and it was hot, and there was enough of it, and out here, on the edge of everything, that was a very great deal to be grateful for. That was, most mornings, a kind of quiet triumph. Let the plates be cleared and scraped for the hogs. The long day is turning again toward its evening, the light going soft and golden and then blue, and the sound that comes drifting up the darkening street now is a piano, slightly and cheerfully out of tune, and beneath it the low, warm rising tide of men's voices. The saloon is filling up, and the saloon, my friend, is a whole world unto itself. The brightest room in town, and, if you look at it too closely, very nearly the foulest. Every town had one. The smallest, meanest, newest scatter of buildings in the whole territory, a place with no church and no school and barely a name, would have a saloon before it had almost anything else. And the real towns had a dozen of them, or 24, lamplight spilling warm and yellow out under their doors and over their swinging louvered gates into the dark of the street. Of all the rooms in the whole of the Old West, the saloon is the one that we have romanticised the hardest, polished the brightest, loved the longest, and it is, I am sorry to tell you, very nearly the one whose ordinary everyday reality would empty a modern stomach the fastest. Begin, as the frontier itself so often did, with the floor, and with the small brass vessel that stood at intervals all along the foot of the bar, and beneath the tables and the card games, the spittoon, the cuspidor. Nearly every man in that room chewed tobacco, plug tobacco, worked in the cheek, a near universal habit, and a man who chews must, constantly and copiously, spit. The spittoon was set out to receive it. That was its entire noble purpose. But aim, across a crowded and increasingly drunken room, was a hopeful and a sometime thing, and the floor of a busy saloon by the middle of a Saturday night was a landscape best not examined too closely by lamplight, dark and slick, and tracked back and forth all evening by muddy boots, by the town's wandering dogs, and by the trailing hems of the dresses of whatever women worked the room. The sawdust strewn down each morning was meant to soak the worst of it up, and be swept out and replaced. It did not always get replaced. The men gave it no thought whatever. It was simply the floor. You did not look at the floor. On the bar itself, near the free lunch, there very often hung a towel, one single towel, fixed to a ring or a rail at a convenient height, and that towel was there, in perfect and genuine hospitality, for the patrons to use, to wipe their hands, to wipe the beer foam and the whiskey from their mouths and their dripping moustaches after a pull. And it served, that one towel, every man who bellied up to that bar, all the day and all the night through, hand after hand and mouth after mouth, and it was not swapped out, and it was not washed, not until it had gone stiff and dark and grey, and could frankly absorb nothing further. The communal bar towel, one of the small and perfectly honest horrors of the age, hung out in pure friendliness, shared without a second thought by every stranger in the room. And the free lunch it hung beside, for the free lunch was a real and celebrated institution, a spread of bread and cheese and pickles and cold-sliced meats and salty things, laid out for free so that any man who bought himself a 5-cent beer might come and eat his fill, and drink, they hoped, a good deal more than one. It was a marvel of frontier generosity. It was also uncovered, and it stood out warm on the end of the bar for hours upon hours, and the flies of the frontiers, which came off the horse-churned streets in truly biblical numbers, in shifting, humming, settling clouds, descended upon all of it, upon the meat and the cheese and the open pickle crock in a living, crawling black veil, and the men waved a hand over it, and shooed the worst of them off, and cut a slab and ate it standing, because it was food, and it was free, and a fly never yet stopped a hungry man who had already made his peace with the well and the tin and the boarding-house bed. And then there was the drink itself, which deserves its own dark chapter. In a proper, settled, prosperous establishment in a real town, a man might well get honest whiskey, decently aged, more or less what it claimed to be. But out at the rough edges of things, in the cheap places, the tent saloons, the road ranches, the whiskey ranches that sold to soldiers and travellers and anyone at all, what was poured out under the proud name of whiskey, was very often not whiskey in any meaningful sense at all. It was raw grain alcohol, or worse, cut with a great deal of water to stretch the profit, and then flavoured and coloured back up into something that could pass for the real article by lamplight to a man who was already 3 drinks in. And the things used to do that flavouring and that colouring are the stuff of quiet nightmares. Tobacco juice for the rich brown colour, burnt sugar, molasses, turpentine for a kick, cayenne pepper, and even gunpowder for the hot bite a drinker expected of strong liquor, and, in the very worst and cheapest of it, a small measure of strychnine, yes, the poison, stirred in to give the drinker that jolting, dangerous electric heat that told him he was getting his money's worth of something powerful. They had names for this poison, names half boastful and half warning, passed around with a rueful grin. Tanglefoot, because it tangled your feet under you. 40-rod whiskey, because it was cheerfully said that a man could not walk 40 rods, a few hundred feet, after drinking it before it dropped him. Tarantula juice, coffin varnish, tonsil paint, snake water. The men drank it down knowing more or less exactly what it was, and it did them precisely the harm you would expect it to, and they came back the following night, and the night after that for more. Picture the bartender then presiding over the whole bright, foul, warm kingdom of it. He's very likely the most respectable-looking man in the entire room. His apron reasonably clean, his hair oiled and parted, his moustache waxed, his manner smooth and easy and welcoming. He takes down a smeared glass and wipes it with the corner of that dreadful grey towel, and pours out a measure of coffin varnish, and slides it ringing down the polished bar to a waiting hand, and takes the coin, and nods, and smiles, and moves to the next man. He is not a villain in this story. He would be honestly puzzled to be cast as one. He is a small businessman in a hard and thirsty place, giving his customers precisely exactly what they have asked him for, at a price they are glad to pay, in a room they would rather be in than anywhere else on earth. The piano plays on, slightly flat, endlessly cheerful. The lamplight is warm and golden. The talk and the laughter rise and fall like a tide. And it is, in its own strange and undeniable way, the beating heart of the whole town. This bright, filthy, friendly, generous, quietly poisonous room, where the frontier came in from the cold and the dark to be, for a few lamplit hours, in the warm company of other souls, come away from it now gently back out through the swinging doors into the cool, clean night. Let us think, while the piano fades behind us, about something quieter and stranger, and in its own way even harder to picture. How these people, in a world so short of water and so long on labour, ever managed to get themselves clean, or rather, the truth of it, which is how they very largely did not. Here is a thing that is genuinely difficult to feel across the long distance of the years, because our own world has scrubbed the memory of it away so completely and so recently. The Old West smelled. All of it. All the time. Everyone in it. And almost no one much noticed, or minded, because there was nothing clean to notice it against. Because everyone alike lived inside that same warm haze of wood smoke and sweat and horse and earth, and a body simply grew up believing that this was what the world and a person was supposed to smell like, which until astonishingly recently it was. The whole trouble came down once again to water, and to the crushing weight of labour bound up in every single drop of it. On the frontier, water did not come from a tap in the wall at the turn of a handle, warm and endless. Every drop of it for a bath had to be hauled, by hand, in a heavy bucket, from the well or the creek or the rain barrel, one aching load at a time, and then heated over a fire that had itself to be built and fed, with wood that had itself to be found, and felled, and chopped, and split, and carried, and stacked. A full hot bath, by the time you traced it all the way back, represented hours of the hardest kind of work. And so it was not, could not be, a daily comfort. It was a genuine and considered undertaking, a project, an event, and it was treated as one. On a great many homesteads, a proper full bath happened once in the week, on Saturday night, in solemn preparation for church on Sunday morning, so that the family might present itself clean and decent before God and the neighbours. That was the rhythm. Filthy all week with honest work, scrubbed pink on Saturday, holy on Sunday, and filthy again by Tuesday. In the harder places, and through the harder seasons, it happened a good deal less even than that. Through the long, shut-in cold of a plains winter, when hauling and heating water was hardest and the cabin was freezing, and a chill could turn to pneumonia and kill you, some families did not truly, fully bathe for the better part of the season. There was a practice real and widespread of children being sewn in the autumn into their long woolen underclothes, quite literally stitched in, and simply not taken out of them again, not fully, until the thaw came in the spring and it was safe once more to be briefly naked and wet. A whole winter in one set of underwear. It kept you warm. That was what mattered. Warmth kept you alive. Cleanliness was a fine weather luxury. And when the Saturday bath did come round, there was, of course, only ever so much hot water to be had for all that labour. A single tin tub, a hip bath, set out on the floor before the kitchen fire and filled, bucket by heavy bucket, with water heated in relays on the stove. One tub, one filling, and a whole family to get through it. So the family bathed one after another in turn in the very same water, and there was an order to it, a settled order that everyone understood, and the order went by rank and by age. The father of the house went first, lowering himself into the clean and steaming water. He had earned it, and he was the head of the household, and the water was at its best for him. Then the mother, then the children, each in turn from the oldest down to the youngest, so that by the time the smallest baby of the family was lowered into the tub, that same water had already washed a father, a mother, and a whole stair-step row of dusty children before it, and had gone grey and tepid and cloudy and thick, and that murky, much-used final water is the origin of an old grim little saying that we still repeat and have entirely forgotten the meaning of. Don't throw the baby out with the bath water. We say it now to mean don't discard the good along with the bad, but it began, so the saying goes, as something far more literal and far more darkly funny, a warning, half a joke, that by the time the baby's turn came at the very end of the line, the water in that tub had grown so grey and so opaque that you had genuinely to take some care, lifting the child back out, not to lose sight of it altogether in the murk and tip it out into the yard along with the wash. It is not, perhaps, quite historically airtight, that origin, but it tells you, better than any careful fact could, exactly how that water looked by the end of a Saturday night. In the towns, a man who wished it, and could pay, might buy a bath at the bathhouse, or in a tin tub in the back room of the barber shop, and many a miner and cowhand, coming in filthy off weeks at a claim or on a trail, gladly did, and considered it a fine and civilised indulgence. But water was dear in town too, and labour dear, and the tubs there were not always emptied and refilled between one paying customer and the next. On a busy Saturday, you might well be paying over your hard coin to lower your own tired body down into the grey and cooling and none too fragrant water of the man who had bathed before you, and the man before him. A shared bath from a stranger for a fee, and a man counted himself the cleaner and the better for it. None of this, and this is the whole of the point, none of this was thought of by anyone as filth. That is the truly disturbing thing, more than any single grubby detail. Not that they were dirty, but that dirt was simply the ordinary and unremarked condition of a human body. In a world where cleanliness cost more labour and more water, and more precious fuel than most people on earth could ever hope to spare, everyone was in the same state, more or less, and so no one stood out and so no one was ashamed. A little sweat, a little smoke in the hair, a little of the good animal smell of the horses and cattle you work beside from dawn to dark. That was just what a living working person was. The modern idea, our idea, that a person ought to be entirely odourless, that one could and should sluice one's whole self fresh and sweet-smelling under hot running water every single morning without a thought or a care. That idea would have struck them not as virtue, but as a kind of soft insanity, a preposterous, wasteful, vain squandering of water and wood and the short, precious hours of a working life. So let them be, our sleepy frontier family, drowsing there clean enough and warm before the dying kitchen fire on a Saturday night, damp hair and pink skin, the grey tub waiting quietly by the door to be dragged out and emptied into the dark of the yard. They have done the long hard work of the whole week, every day of it from dark to dark. They have hauled and heated every drop of that water by the strength of their own backs, and they have earned, tonight, their clean skin and their deep and dreamless rest. Not everyone in town is resting, though. Down at the end of the street, behind a single lit and curtained window, a lamp is still burning late in the front room of a particular house, the undertaker's house. And in that lamplit window, there is something on quiet display that you and I would find very hard indeed to look upon, and that the good people of this town, young and old, will line up in the morning to see with their own eyes, and think nothing strange of it at all. Of all the many ways the Old West differed from our own soft and sheltered time, there is none, I think, that is stranger to the modern heart than its easy, daily, matter-of-fact closeness to death. Not the violence of death. We imagine the violence well enough, perhaps too well. I mean the plain domestic nearness of it. Death, on the frontier, was not a thing shut away, sanitized and handled by paid strangers in distant buildings, glimpsed by the rest of us only once or twice in a lifetime and then hurried past. Death happened in the front room of the house. It was washed and dressed by the hands of the family. It stayed there a while among them, and was sat with, and looked at, and even photographed, and no one who did so thought themselves the least bit ghoulish or strange for it. They thought themselves loving, and they were right. Consider first the photograph. A camera in the 1870s was a rare and costly and terribly cumbersome thing, and a proper photographic portrait, a real likeness, fixed forever on a plate or a card, was a genuine expense, something a poor or an ordinary frontier family might manage only once in a great while, or once in a whole lifetime, or truthfully never at all. Photographs were precious beyond our understanding, because a face, once gone, was simply gone. There was no other way to keep it. And so, with a logic that is at once terrible and unbearably tender, the one single occasion on which a struggling family would find the money and send for the photographer and gather everyone together and dress them all in their sober best and hold them very, very still, was very often after someone had died, especially a child. Child death was so common, as we will come to, that a great many families had no living portrait of a little one at all. The child had come and been loved and died, all in the space before there was ever money or occasion for a picture. And so the photograph taken after death was, in heartbreaking truth, the only image of that small face the family would ever possess, the only thing left to keep and to grieve over and to set upon the mantelpiece and to show the grandchildren one day. Of course they took it. How could they not? So the photographer would come, with his black cloth and his great wooden box and his long, slow exposures, and the small body would be washed, and dressed as if for its Sunday best or for a gentle sleep, and carefully arranged, laid in a cradle, or a favourite little chair, or held tenderly in a mother's living arms. The eyes were sometimes left gently closed, as though only sleeping, and sometimes, by various sad devices, held or painted open, to make the picture seem more like life, more like the child that was, and the living family gathered close around, and held their breath, and held their stillness through the long exposure, so that in the finished image it is not always easy, at a glance, to tell the living from the one they have lost. These photographs, we sometimes call them memorial portraits, or by a French phrase that means "remember you must die," were not morbid to the people who made them. They were made from love, and kept from love, and shown to visiting relatives without the smallest flicker of embarrassment or unease. It was simply the last thing, the only thing, a grieving family could still do for the one they had lost, and so they did it, and treasured the doing. And then there was the other kind of display, the public kind, which is a good deal harder to defend to a modern conscience, and which was every bit as ordinary. When a notorious outlaw, a road agent, a killer, a man with a price on his head, was at last hunted down and shot, his body did not quietly and decently disappear. It became an event, a public spectacle, and frankly a piece of civic entertainment. The corpse would be cleaned up and its wounds arranged, and it would be dressed and then propped upright, stood against a wall, or lashed to a board or a plank or a barn door to hold it up straight and stiff for the camera. And sometimes a rifle or a pistol would be placed in the dead and rigid hands to make a better picture, and it would be photographed formally, and those photographs printed and sold as souvenirs, and the body itself would be set out on public view, in the front window of the undertaker's, or laid on a board across two barrels on the boardwalk, or stood up in a doorway, so that the whole town might file slowly past and look upon it, and be certain and satisfied. And they came. Crowds came. Fathers brought their children by the hand to look at the dead outlaw, and lifted the little ones up for a better view. It was proof, made solid and undeniable, that a long terror was finally over. And it was, quite frankly and without apology, a show. And no soul in that filing crowd saw the smallest contradiction in bringing the family along to see it. The undertaker himself, the man who kept these bodies and arranged these displays, was very often the town photographer as well, and the furniture maker, and the cabinet maker, and the man who built the coffins. It was a practical bundling together of trades, when you think it through, for all of them touched one way or another upon the same solemn and unavoidable human business of the end, and a small town could not support a specialist in each. His front room, the good room of the house, where the dead were laid out on display for viewing and mourning before the burial, was called the parlour. And ordinary families held these viewings in their own homes too, in the finest and most formal room of the house, the room kept shut and clean and unused for special and important occasions, which is the quiet and forgotten origin of a phrase we still use every day and never think about: the funeral parlour. It was, simply, the parlour, the good front room, the room where you received your most important guests, and where, in its time, when the time came, you also received, and washed, and dressed, and sat up all night with, your own beloved dead. There was no cold to hold a body, remember, nothing to slow the turning. And so all of this happened swiftly, over a day or two at the very most, before the plain pine coffin, built likely that same day by that same busy undertaker, was carried out on the shoulders of the neighbours to the small fenced plot of ground at the edge of town. Death came close, on the frontier. It came into the house. It was washed and dressed and combed by loving hands, and sat up with through the long night, and looked upon, and photographed and wept over, and then carried out and buried by the very people who had loved the one who died. It was terrible. It was intimate beyond anything our age can easily imagine, and it was entirely, unremarkably daily normal. Draw the curtain gently now across that lamplit window. We will speak no more of it tonight. It is late, and there are softer things to think of on the way down into sleep. Let us turn instead, as the town itself so loved to, towards something that came rolling into town every now and again like a carnival, all bright paint and music and dazzling promise, and left, quietly, a little poison behind it wherever its wheels had passed. Every so often, and it was always a red-letter day, a break in the long sameness of frontier weeks, a wagon would come rolling into town unlike any other wagon the townsfolk owned or had seen, painted in bright, gaudy, peeling colours, hung about with banners and gilt lettering and strings of little flags, and driven by a man who called himself Doctor, or more grandly still Professor, and who was, we may say with near-perfect confidence, neither one. The medicine show had arrived, and for a night, or two, or three, it would be far and away the most exciting thing to happen to that town in months. For the medicine show understood something that the honest doctor and the plain shopkeeper never troubled to learn, and that the finest advertisers of our own age have only refined, that you do not sell a man a cure by frightening him about his sickness. You sell it to him by first making him happy, and warm, and grateful, and glad, and by then, gently, while his guard is all the way down, letting him buy. So there was a free performance first, always. That was the whole engine of the thing, the bright hook on which all the rest was hung. There would be music, a banjo, a fiddle, a fine strong singer. There would be jokes and patter, and a comic turn, perhaps a blackface act as the cruel fashion of the time so often was, or a man doing rope tricks or juggling, or a little sleight-of-hand magic, or a trained and clever dog that could count. And the whole town would gather in the dusk in a loose-glad crowd around the lit and lantern-hung wagon, laughing, applauding, delighted, their long week forgotten, their guard set gently and entirely down. And then, when the crowd was good and warm and laughing and pleased with the world and with the professor who had brought them all this free wonder, his tone would change. He would step to the front of his little stage and grow serious and confiding and kind, and he would begin to speak in a low and earnest and fatherly voice about a certain truly remarkable preparation, a tonic, a liniment, a cordial, a discovery. His discovery, wrung from the secret lore of some far-off people, or the mysterious roots of some distant land, and the wonderful thing about it, the truly, gloriously wonderful thing, was that it did not cure merely one ailment. It cured them all. Rheumatism and consumption, weak nerves and thin blood and low spirits, headaches, backaches, toothaches, female complaints and male complaints, and complaints there were no polite names for, baldness, deafness, dropsy, fits, and, always, whispered gravely and never quite promised outright, the great and terrible diseases too, the cancer, the wasting, the things the honest doctors could only shake their heads over. He had seen it work miracles, the professor said. He had seen the lame walk and the suffering rise up laughing. And here, why here was a man right here in the crowd tonight, a local seeming fellow who had been near crippled with the rheumatism for a dozen years and could scarcely rise from his chair. "Come up, sir, don't be shy. Show these good people how you walk now since you took the tonic." And the man would spring up, sprightly and spry as a boy, and stride about and kick his heels and testify to his miraculous cure. And not one soul in that warm and hopeful crowd would ever guess that the same nimble fellow had ridden into town on the wagon that very morning, and would ride out on it again come dawn, his rheumatism as fictional as his gratitude, the planted shill, the salted testimonial, as old as commerce and as fresh as tomorrow. And then the bottles came out, from their crates in the back of the wagon by the dozen and the case, and the money came out from the pockets and the purses of the crowd. And half the town would go home that night the proud owner of a bottled cure for a disease they did not yet have, laid carefully by against the evil day when they surely would. And what was in the bottles? Very often, first and foremost, a great deal of alcohol, a powerful slug of it, enough that a stern and temperate farm wife who would sooner die than let a drop of sinful whiskey pass her lips could, and did, dose herself into a warm and rosy daily glow upon her medicinal tonic, 3 times a day as directed, and call it health, and mean it. And beyond the comforting alcohol, in bottle after bottle, the true quiet horrors. Opium again, and its cousin morphine, to soothe and to dull and to bind. Cocaine, for a bright false vigour. Mercury, quicksilver, dosed for a whole grim catalogue of complaints, and slowly, faithfully, poisoning every single soul who took it, loosening their teeth and darkening their gums and shaking their hands. And arsenic, sold, believe this, drifting off, though it sounds like a fever dream, sold openly as a beauty and health tonic. A few careful drops taken to bring a fashionable pale bloom to the complexion, and a bright liquid sparkle to the eye. A sparkle and a bloom which were, in sober fact, the first soft telltale glow of arsenic poisoning setting quietly to work. There was one famous liniment sold up and down the whole West that went by the name of snake oil, genuinely, proudly marketed as a wondrous extract pressed from snakes, and promising to loosen every stiff and aching joint in the human frame. And when a bottle of it was at last, years on, taken to a laboratory and honestly examined, it was found to contain no snake of any description whatsoever, only mineral oil, and a little beef fat, and some red pepper for the warming tingle, and a whiff of turpentine. Nothing else. Nothing that could heal so much as a splinter. And from that one gaudy and shameless fraud we drew a phrase that has outlived every man who ever bought a bottle. Snake oil, which we still use, and always will, for any beautiful, worthless lie sold with a warm smile and a firm handshake. But in its own day, understand, people rubbed that snake oil into their aching backs and knees with real and desperate hope, and swore by it to their neighbours, and came back gladly to buy more, and the show would fold its banners and pack its crates and slip quietly out of town in the deep of the night, its lanterns swinging away down the dark road toward the next town, and the next crowd, and the next case of bottles, always gone, always already gone, before any man's miracle cure had been given time to fail him. That was the whole genius of the travelling show. The professor was never there in the cold light of the morning after. He was always 3 towns on, and here is the strangest part, the part that ought to unsettle us most of all and does. The people were not fools to buy. That is what I want you to carry with you down into sleep, and it is the same gentle truth that runs beneath this whole long night. They lived in a world of real, constant, grinding, untreatable pain, and precious little honest medicine anywhere in it. The nearest real doctor was far away, and dear and armed when you reached him, with remedies that were themselves as likely as not to be useless or worse. For the honest medicine of the age was not so very far ahead of the fraud. When nothing that anyone can offer you truly works, then a bottle of bright hope, sold to you by lamplight with a banjo and a wink and a kindly word, is not, when you really weigh it, such an unreasonable thing to spend your few hard coins upon. They were reaching, all of them, in the dark, for anything at all that might ease the pain of being alive in a hard place, and a smiling man in a painted wagon was only ever too glad to sell them the dark by the bottle, and roll on. Let the wagon roll then, out of our town and away, its lanterns swinging into the enormous night, its music fading behind it down the road. There is one more small lamplit room I want to show you before the town goes finally dark, a snug and pretty and feminine little room up above the street where a young woman is dressing, with the greatest of care and the highest of hopes, for a dance, and where she is, all unknowing, quietly and lovingly poisoning herself, in the name of being beautiful. In a snug little room above the main street, by the soft and forgiving light of a single oil lamp, a young woman is dressing for a dance. Her name is Clara, and she is 19 years old, and there is a dance this very Saturday night, in the hall out at the edge of town, with a real fiddler come all the way from the county seat, and she has thought of very little else all the long week, and now, at last, the evening has come, and she sits before her small clouded looking-glass in her shift, and she's making herself beautiful, with a care and a seriousness and a trembling hope that reach right across the century and take us gently by the heart. Because we have every one of us sat before some mirror like it, on some night that mattered, and wished with our whole soul to be lovely. What Clara does not know, what she has no way in the world of knowing, is that very nearly everything laid out on her little dressing table is, in some slow and quiet measure, a poison. The ideal of beauty in Clara's world, the thing all the magazines and the advertisements and her own dear mother held up as loveliness, was paleness. A pale, smooth, luminous, untouched skin, white as milk, white as the moon. And the reason was not mere fashion, but something deeper and sadder, because a brown, weathered, sun-darkened skin was the plain mark of a woman who had to labour out of doors, a poor woman, a working woman, bent all day over a field or a washtub in the open sun. And a fine pale skin was the mark, the prized and envied mark, of a lady who did not, a lady of leisure, of shade, of parasols and drawn blinds and idle mornings. To be pale was to be genteel. To be pale was to have risen, or to seem to have risen, above the common lot. And so a woman went to real and startling lengths to be pale, and the lengths she went to were terrible. The face powders and the paints of the age, the things that gave that smooth, opaque, flawless, ghostly white finish that fashion so admired, were very often built upon a foundation of white lead. Ceruse, it was sometimes called. It had been used for exactly this by women who wished to be beautiful, for literally thousands of years. It worked wonderfully. It gave precisely the poreless marble whiteness that was wanted, and it was absorbed, slowly and steadily, day after painted day, straight through the skin it covered, poisoning the blood, yes, over the long run, but first and most cruelly poisoning and corroding that very skin itself, coarsening it, greying it, breaking it out in sores and blemishes, so that a woman who used it found she needed ever more of it, a heavier and heavier coat to cover over the very damage that the powder itself was doing, and so was drawn, without ever seeing the trap close, into a slow, tightening spiral that could, across the years, quietly ruin a complexion and a constitution and a life, in the very pursuit of preserving them. For those who wished to go further still, there were the arsenic complexion wafers, and these were not some furtive back-alley poison whispered about in shame. They were sold openly, advertised boldly and beautifully in the newspapers and the ladies' magazines, and they were eaten. Swallowed. Small measured doses of arsenic taken faithfully by mouth day upon day to clear the skin of every blemish from within and to bring about that fashionable, translucent, otherworldly pallor that the paints could only imitate from without. And here is the darkest joke of it. They worked. They truly worked in exactly the way such things work. The pale and interesting translucency they produced was quite real, because it was the genuine pallor of a body being slowly and deliberately poisoned from the inside out. Women took them for years, chasing a deathly glow and slowly, faithfully earning it. And there, among the little pots and papers on Clara's dressing table, there might well sit a small dark bottle of eye drops made from belladonna, from the deadly nightshade, one of the most poisonous plants that grows anywhere upon the earth. A drop of it, touched carefully to each eye, would widen and darken the pupil into a great black liquid dreaming pool, and give a young woman's gaze exactly that large and languid and melting look so admired across a crowded dance floor by soft lamplight. The very name of the plant tells the whole sad story. Belladonna, from the Italian meaning beautiful woman. Named for precisely this use by generations of women who had gone before Clara and done exactly what she's about to do. And what the drops also did, with every repetition, was to blur the sight and to make the eyes ache in any bright light. And in the fullness of years, taken often enough, they could dim and cloud and steal that eyesight altogether. She is trading away tonight a little sliver of her eyes, for the way her eyes will look tonight. She does not know one particle of any of this, not the smallest part of it. How could she? She reads the very same bright advertisements that every woman she admires reads, all of them promising a fine clear complexion and a bright and speaking eye. She uses the very same preparations her own mother uses, and her married sister, and the prettiest and most envied girls in the whole town. She's doing nothing that is not ordinary, nothing that is not respectable, nothing that is not simply expected of a young woman who wishes to look her best. She is only, in the oldest and most forgivable way there is, trying with her whole hopeful heart to be beautiful for one single warm evening of music and lamplight and company, and maybe, if the night is kind, a certain young man's eyes. The poison is not in Clara's small and lovely vanity. There is nothing wrong with Clara at all. The poison is in the bottles and the pots and the papers, sold to her as beauty over the counter, by a whole wide world that did not know, or did not trouble itself to care, what it was truly selling to its daughters. So let her finish. Let Clara pinch a last little natural bloom of colour up into her cheeks with her own fingers, and lean close to the clouded glass and tuck a stray curl, and smile at herself, uncertain and hopeful, and so very young. Let her draw her shawl about her shoulders and blow out the lamp and go down the narrow stairs and out into the soft night, toward the light and the music of the hall. She looks beautiful. She truly, truly does. And the harm is invisible and slow and years away on a night that is not this night. And tonight there is only the fiddle tuning up, and the warm dark and the whole shining evening lying ahead of her, unspent. The music is starting up now, down at the end of the street. Let Clara have her dance. She has earned it as much as anyone, and let us, you and I, begin now to make our own slow way towards sleep. But there is one last part of frontier life that we must sit with quietly before the lamps of our town go finally out. The tenderest and the hardest of all the things we will speak of tonight. Let us be gentle with it, and then we will let it go. We have saved for last the thing that is hardest of all to hold in the hand, and we will hold it gently and not too long, and then we will set it down and let the whole town sleep. Children, on the frontier, worked. Not now and then, not as some unlucky hardship visited upon a few pitiable families, but as the plain, expected, unquestioned condition of childhood itself. This is difficult to feel from inside our own world, where childhood is a walled and watched and gentle garden, all play and school and safety, and where we child-proof the very corners of our tables. On the frontier there was no such garden because there could not be. A homestead, a ranch, a farm was a single labouring organism, and it survived, it ate, it kept its roof, it made it through the winter, only if every pair of hands upon it worked, and worked hard, and every pair of hands included the small ones. A child of 5 or 6 already had real and daily tasks and knew it, and took a real pride in it. Gathering the eggs, hauling water in a small bucket, feeding the chickens, minding the babies still smaller than themselves, gathering chips of dried dung off the prairie for the fire where there was no wood. By 8 or 9, a frontier child was doing the genuine work of a small adult, driving the cattle to water, herding the sheep, hoeing and weeding and helping bring in the harvest, chopping and hauling and stacking wood, hauling and heating that endless water, cooking over an open fire, minding a whole brood of littler siblings for hours entirely alone. There was schooling, yes, where there happened to be a school within walking distance and a season slow enough to spare the children to it. But the work always came first, in every family, without apology and without exception. Because the work was quite simply the difference between the family eating and the family not eating, between surviving the coming winter and not surviving it. A child understood this early, in the bone, and did their share. And the frontier was, for a small child, a place of endless, patient, casual, everyday danger. Picture it. Open wells with no cover, and swift cold creeks to fall into and drown. Heavy horses and oxen that kicked and bolted and crushed. Rattlesnakes coiled in the woodpile and the tall grass and the cool space beneath the cabin. Fire, always fire, everywhere fire. In a whole world made of open flames and greased lamps and wooden houses and endless miles of dry summer grass. Guns kept loaded and ready and within easy reach in very nearly every home, against wolves and rustlers and worse. Farm machinery, heavy and sharp and turning, with no guard on any moving part of it. And a small child moved among all of these all day, every day, through a world simply bristling with hazards that we would find frankly unthinkable, that we spend fortunes today to fence our children away from, and moved among them very largely unwatched, alone or with only another child scarcely older, for long stretches of hours. Because the grown people were working too, because they had to be, because there was simply no one to spare from the labour merely to stand and watch a child who, God willing, would most likely be all right. And so, sometimes they were not all right, and this is the hard, quiet, heavy heart of the whole matter, the thing that shaped and shadowed everything else in frontier life. Children died, not rarely, not as a scandal, not as a shocking and unnatural tragedy that stopped the world, but commonly, and, God have mercy on them, half expectedly. Of every handful of children born out on the frontier, a truly heartbreaking share of them did not live to grow up. They were taken by the diseases lurking in the water, the cholera and the typhoid and the bloody flux, by the fevers, the scarlet fever, the diphtheria that strangled a child in a night, the whooping cough, the measles, the ordinary summer sickness, that a modern doctor would wave calmly away in a single afternoon with a bottle of something, and that then simply carried children off, in their hundreds, in their thousands, by the accidents, by the hard winters. And the families of the frontier were so large, so many children, one after another, in no small part because of this. Because a mother and a father could not, dared not, assume that the children they bore would be the children they raised. And so they bore many, and loved them fiercely, and braced their own hearts, and hoped, and buried the ones they lost, and went on. You can still read the whole of it, faintly, in the old graveyards that stand yet at the edges of those frontier towns, if ever you walk through one. You can see it in how very many of the stones are small, in how many of the carved dates barely span a year, or 2, or a handful of months. A whole clustered row of little markers sometimes, all crowded there behind a single weathered family name, a mother's whole several years' work of love and hope and labour laid in the ground in a line. And you can read it too in the way the people themselves wrote and spoke of it, in their letters and their journals and their worn Bibles. Not without grief, never for one moment without grief, for their grief was as deep and as wild as any grief of ours, and deeper for how relentlessly and how often it came calling. But there is in their words a kind of terrible, worn, matter-of-fact steadiness about it, a readiness, a bracing. because a heart that shattered utterly and stayed shattered at every single loss simply could not have gone on. And they had, above all things, to go on. There was stock to be fed in the cold morning, whatever had happened in the night. There were the other living children, who still needed their supper and their mother's arms, and a reason to believe the world was good. It is, in the end, the most disturbing thing of all, more disturbing than any poison or any filth or any casual violence we have touched tonight, and it is at the very same moment the most tender and the most deeply human. Not cruelty, never cruelty, the very opposite of cruelty. It is the sheer, worn, unbearable, matter-of-fact nearness of loss, woven so tightly and so permanently into the daily fabric of ordinary life that people had no choice but to learn to live alongside it, the way you learn to live alongside the weather and the seasons and the turning of the hard year. They loved their children, everyone, exactly as fiercely and as tenderly and as helplessly as you love yours, as anyone ever has or ever will. They simply could not count on keeping them, and they knew it, in their bones, every day, and they built their hearts deliberately to be strong enough to bear the breaking, and they went on, and they raised the ones who lived, and out of all that quiet daily courage they built, without ever once meaning to or knowing it, the gentler and safer and better lit world that you and I get to fall asleep inside of tonight. So let us be tender with them then, these ordinary, weary, loving, unremarkable people, in their hard and dangerous and ungentle world, and let us be quietly and enormously and undeservingly grateful, you and I, for the soft and safe and well-lighted and medicine-guarded age that we have been so lucky as to be born into and to fall asleep in tonight. The lamps are beginning to go out now, one by one, all up and down the single street of our little town. But we're not quite done, for there are a few last rooms and roads of this old world I want to walk you slowly through. On the way down into sleep, a few last ordinary corners of the frontier that the storybooks have quietly tidied up. Come, there is no hurry in any of it. Let us begin with the thing that hangs, this very moment, on the hip of nearly every grown man asleep or awake in this town, the thing we have made the very emblem of the West and misunderstood almost entirely. Of everything in the whole mythology of the Old West, nothing is more central, more polished, more beloved than the gun. The 6-shooter riding low on the hip, the fast draw at high noon in the empty street, 2 men squared off, the town holding its breath, hands hovering over the grips, and then the blur and the shot and the slow fall in the dust. We have watched it 10,000 times. It is the very heart of the legend, and it is, very nearly from beginning to end, an invention, a thing dreamed up by dime novelists, and later by the movies, that scarcely ever happened in the actual dusty life of the actual West at all. The truth of the gun on the frontier is stranger than the legend, and quieter, and in its own way a good deal more unsettling. Let us begin with that famous fast-draw duel, the quick-draw showdown, because it is the purest fiction of all. It essentially did not happen. That formal, ritual, face-to-face contest, the 2 gunfighters pacing off in the street at midday, waiting on some signal, drawing on the instant to see who was faster, is almost wholly a creation of later storytellers. Real frontier violence, when it came, was nothing so clean or so sporting or so fair. It was sudden and squalid and usually drunk. It happened at a range of a few feet across a card table or a bar in a flash of temper. It happened from behind and from ambush and in the back. Men were shot in the course of a stupid quarrel that had spiraled out of a spilled drink or a wrong word or a bad hand at cards, shot before they rightly knew a fight had even begun. There was no code, no count, no fair and even second. There was a drunk man and a grievance and a loaded gun close to hand and then a body on the floor. That was frontier gunplay, very nearly always, nasty, brief, and graceless. But here is the truly disturbing thing about the gun in the West, the thing the legend hides completely. It was not, for the most part, the aimed and intended shot that did the killing and the maiming. It was the accident. Guns were everywhere, absolutely everywhere, as common and constant an object as a knife or a hat, and they were carried and handled and set down and picked up with a casual daily carelessness that would stop a modern heart. And the guns of the day, especially the older cap and ball revolvers and the cheap ones, were genuinely mechanically dangerous to their own owners, prone to going off if they were dropped, or knocked, or jolted, or if the hammer was let to rest, as men so often carelessly let it rest, directly upon a live and loaded chamber. So they went off. They went off when a man's horse stumbled and the pistol jarred in its holster. They went off when a fellow set his gun belt down on the bed and it slid to the floor. They went off in a man's own waistband as he sat, wounding him in the leg, or worse, in a way too foolish and too shameful to want recorded. They went off while being cleaned, while being loaded, while being shown off, while being passed from hand to admiring hand. And they went off, God help them, in the hands of children. For in a home where a loaded gun stood always in the corner, or hung always on its peg within a child's reach, and where the grown folk were out working the long day, a curious small boy and a curious loaded pistol were bound now and again to find one another. It happened. It happened often enough that it was simply one more of the frontier's patient, everyday, ordinary dangers, filed alongside the well and the woodpile and the snake in the grass. A gun was a tool, and it lived in the house like any other tool, and it was no more locked away or thought about than the axe or the kettle. And so, quietly, in 100 small ways that never made a dime novel or a ballad, the gun killed and crippled the very people who owned it, far more surely and far more often than it ever settled a fair fight in a sunlit street. The saloons of the rougher towns understood this danger perfectly well, from long and bloody experience, and it is the reason for a piece of the real West that the legend gets exactly backwards. A great many frontier towns, the very cattle towns whose names ring loudest in the myth, the Dodge cities and the Aberleens, had strict laws against the carrying of guns within the town limits. A cowhand riding in off the trail was required, by law and by the town marshal, to check his guns, to hand them over at the sheriff's office, or the saloon, or a corral, and go about the town unarmed and collect them again on his way out. The whole point of the frontier lawman, the real day-to-day work of him, was very largely this. Not the grand showdown of the movies, but the dull and thankless and endless business of disarming drunk young men before they could shoot each other, or themselves, or some bystander, over nothing at all. The West in its own towns was often a good deal more disarmed than the modern imagination allows. The men who ran those towns had buried too many fools to feel romantic about it. When a man was shot and did not die at once, there was the after, and the after was frequently worse than the ball itself. A bullet wound, in a world with no antiseptic and no antibiotic and no true understanding of infection, was a slow and dreadful lottery. The doctor, or the barber, or the man's own friends would go digging after the lead with an unwashed probe and an unwashed finger, and pack the wound with who knew what, and the true killings so often came days later, in the fever and the swelling and the sweet rot of an infection nobody could see coming, or do a thing to stop. Men shot in the belly were simply, quietly given up for dead, and made as comfortable as could be managed while they died, slowly, over days, of the wound turning inside them, and the polite and rueful phrase the frontier coined for a man killed by gunfire, died of lead poisoning, was grim frontier humour, a dry joke, but it carried, without meaning to, a sad sideways truth. The lead itself was rarely the whole of what killed you. It was everything that came after the lead, in a world that did not yet know how to keep a wound clean. So let the guns hang then, on their pegs and their hips, all up and down the sleeping street, as common as boots, as careless as coins, and far more dangerous to the men who own them than to any painted outlaw in any story. The legend gave us the fast draw, and the fair fight, and the clean, bright violence of noon. The truth gave us the dropped pistol, the drunk quarrel, the curious child, the slow fever days later in a back room. It is quieter than the legend, but it is truer, and it is, at this hour, quite safely 150 years away. Come away from it. The street is nearly dark now, but there is one more lit and smoky window I want to bring you past before we let the town sleep. The one where the lamps burn latest and lowest of all, and where more frontier blood was spilled over a folded rectangle of pasteboard than was ever spilled in any fair fight in the sun. Let us look quietly in at the gambling hall. The gambling hall on the frontier was not a shameful thing hidden away in a back alley. It was a bright and central and perfectly respectable institution, very often the grandest and most gaslit room in the whole town, its tables running the length of a saloon, or filling a hall all their own, and it never truly closed. A frontier boomtown ran on hope, and on money, and on the endless nervous circulation of both, and there was no purer distillation of the whole restless spirit of the place than a table with a deck of cards upon it, and a ring of hard, hopeful, watchful faces gathered round. Men who had crossed half a continent to gamble their whole lives on a mine or a herd or a patch of dry ground were hardly going to blink at gambling their wages on the turn of a card. It was the same faith, only faster. The great game of the West, the one you have likely never heard of, though it reigned supreme for decades over every game we now remember, was faro. Faro was everywhere, in every hall, at every hour. It was fast and simple to learn, and it moved money across the table quicker than almost anything else. It was played on a table laid with a painted board of cards, and the players bet on which cards would fall as the dealer drew them from his box, and the sign of the game, hung outside or painted on the window to call the players in, was the picture of a Bengal tiger, which is the forgotten root of a phrase that outlived the game entirely. To gamble hard and recklessly at faro was to buck the tiger, or to fight the tiger, and a man on a wild losing streak was said to be doing battle with the tiger and losing. The game is all but gone now, vanished so completely that its very name means nothing to us. But for a long generation the tiger ruled the West, and the tiger was very largely rigged. This is the plain and unromantic truth of frontier gambling that the legend leaves out. An enormous share of it was crooked, and more or less openly known to be crooked, and played anyway. The faro box itself, the little device the dealer drew the cards from, could be had in a gaffed or rigged version. A rigged box, secretly built to let a crooked dealer control which card came out, and these were manufactured and advertised and sold quite openly to those in the trade. The professional gambler, the sharp, the man who did this for his living and dressed well on the proceeds, came to the table armed with a whole quiet arsenal. Cards marked on their backs in ways only he could read, cards trimmed a hair's breadth so his fingers could find them by feel, hold-out devices strapped up his sleeve to slip a good card into his hand and a bad one out of it, mirrors and confederates and signals and a lifetime's practice sleight of hand. The honest player, the cowhand or the miner sitting down with his season's wages, was very often a lamb who had wandered smiling into a shearing shed, and half the time he more or less knew it, and sat down anyway, because the lights were bright and the whiskey was flowing and the hope was the whole point, and a man had to be in the game to feel it. And because so much of it was crooked, and because the stakes were a man's entire livelihood, and because the players were armed and proud and very often drunk, the gambling table was, in cold statistical fact, one of the deadliest few square feet in the entire West. Far more men died over cards than ever died in the fair and famous street duels of the legend. Died because a losing man's suspicion boiled over into an accusation, and the accusation into a grab for a gun, and then the sudden ugly close-range murder that was the true and only real form of frontier gunplay. A cheat discovered, or merely suspected. A debt refused. A drunk man convinced, rightly or wrongly, that the tiger he was bucking had teeth filed sharp against him in particular. The green cloth of the card table soaked up more frontier blood, quietly, night after night, than all the sunlit showdowns ever dreamed up in all the dime novels put together. The most famous death in the entire history of the American West happened at exactly such a table, and it tells you everything. Wild Bill Hickok, scout, lawman, gunfighter, and by then a fading legend making his living at cards in the gold camp of Deadwood, sat down to a game of poker one August afternoon in the back of a saloon. And Wild Bill Hickok had one lifelong ironclad superstitious rule at the card table, learned in a hard school: he never ever sat with his back to the door. He always took the seat in the corner facing the room, where no man could come at him unseen. But on this one afternoon the corner seat was taken, and the man in it would not trade, and Bill, against all his own long instinct, laughing it off, letting it go, sat down at last with his back to the open door, and a nobody named Jack McCall walked in behind him and put a pistol to the back of his head and shot him dead where he sat, for reasons no one has ever entirely settled, and the cards fell from Wild Bill's hand onto the table, and the hand he was holding as he died, 2 black aces and 2 black eights, has been known ever since, in poker rooms the whole world over, wherever men still gather to gamble, as the dead man's hand. That is the real West in a single image, not a fair fight at high noon, a legend shot in the back of the head, over cards in a filthy gold camp, because he gave up his safe seat just once. The West killed its heroes exactly as squalidly as it killed everyone else. So the lamps burn on, low and late, over the green cloth and the marked cards in the little tiger-painted box. Men lean in, and hope, and lose, and now and then die, in the deadliest and most ordinary room in town. It is a hard place, the gambling hall, under all its brightness. But it is only money, and only cards, and it is very far away and very long ago, and there is nothing in it now that can trouble your rest. Come away from the smoke and the low talk, back out into the clean night air. There is a harder thing still I must show you before we let the town go all the way down into the dark, a thing that happened not in the shadows and the vice of the place, but right out in the open, in the broad light of civic day, with the whole respectable town gathered round to watch. Let us speak, quietly and briefly, of frontier justice and of the rope. We come now to a hard thing, and I will not linger in it, for it is not a restful thing to dwell on, but it belongs in any honest telling of the ordinary frontier because it was ordinary, and because it happened not in secret, in the dark, among criminals, but in the open, in daylight, as a kind of public civic occasion that decent people attended and organised and brought their children to. It is the matter of frontier justice, and of what men did when they decided they could not wait for the law, or when there was as yet no law at all to wait for. You must first understand the true condition of the early frontier, which was this. The settlers and the miners and the townsfolk very often arrived and built and lived and worked in places that had, in any real sense, no functioning law whatever. No court within 100 hard miles. No judge, no jail, no sheriff, or one lone overwhelmed marshal responsible for a territory the size of a European country. The machinery of ordinary justice, the courtroom, the trial, the jury, the appeal, the slow, careful weighing of guilt, simply had not yet arrived, or had arrived so thin and so far off as to be useless to a town facing a thief or a killer in its own streets tonight. And into that vacuum, that lawless empty space, the people poured their own rough substitute. They called it, without embarrassment, popular justice, or vigilance. And the men who did it, banded together into vigilance committees, called themselves vigilantes, a word that then carried none of the shadow it carries for us, but meant simply the watchful ones, the citizens who kept order because no one else would. And the order they kept was the order of the rope. When a man was taken, a suspected horse thief, a suspected killer, a suspected road agent, and there was no court to try him, and no jail to hold him, the Vigilance Committee, made up of the town's own leading and respectable citizens, the merchants and the ranchers and the churchgoers, would try him themselves, on the spot, in a saloon or a street, in an hour with no lawyer and no appeal and no real defence. And if they judged him guilty, as they very nearly always did, they hanged him. From a tree, from a beam, from a wagon tongue propped up, from the crossbar of a corral gate, and they did it in the open, and they did it soon, often within the very hour of the verdict. They had grim, jaunty, joking names for it, the way the frontier had a dry joke for everything that frightened it. A hanging was a necktie party, or a necktie social. To be hanged was to be given a sundance, or to dance on air, or to be strung up. The tree used often enough for the purpose became known, wherever it stood, as the hanging tree, and a town might point one out for years after with a kind of dark pride. And these were not furtive, midnight, hooded affairs, shameful and hidden. They were public. They were, God forgive them, entertainment, and a social occasion, and a lesson meant to be seen. The whole town would turn out. Crowds would gather, people would put on their better clothes, vendors, in the larger public hangings, would work the crowd, and parents would bring their children, and lift the little ones onto their shoulders for a clear view of the condemned man's last moments, believing sincerely that to witness the wages of crime would teach a child to walk the straight path. Afterward, souvenirs were sometimes taken. A snip of the fatal rope was thought lucky, and lengths of hanging rope were genuinely cut up and shared out and kept. And the deepest horror of it, the thing that ought to trouble us most, is not the cruelty, for these were not mostly cruel people, and many of them believed with their whole hearts that they were doing a hard and necessary and even a holy duty, holding back the dark, protecting their families in a place where nothing else would. The deepest horror is the certainty, the speed, the utter absence of doubt. For a real court, with all its maddening slowness, its rules of evidence, its presumption of innocence, its lawyers and its appeals and its careful weighing. That whole cumbersome apparatus exists for one reason above all others, because often, the obvious guilty man is not guilty at all, and a rope thrown over a branch in the heat of an afternoon, decided by a frightened and angry crowd in under an hour, offers no way back. It cannot be appealed. It cannot be undone in the morning when the new evidence comes to light, or the real thief is found 2 counties over, or the witness admits he lied, and so, along with the genuinely guilty, the frontier's swift rope certainly took the innocent, and the merely unpopular, and the stranger who looked wrong, and the man on the losing side of a land feud dressed up as justice, took them in daylight, before applauding crowds with no way ever to give them back. It was justice, they told themselves, and sometimes it was, and sometimes it was only fear, and a rope, and a crowd, and a terrible unbreakable certainty on an ordinary afternoon. I will leave it there, it is enough. I raise it only because it was real and common and done in the open by ordinary people who thought themselves good and slept soundly after, which is, when you turn it over, the quiet lesson underneath this whole long night. The people of the past were not monsters. They were us, in harder circumstances, with less knowledge and fewer choices and no one to tell them better. And the things they did without a second thought would freeze our blood, exactly as some ordinary thing we do tonight, without a second thought, may one day freeze the blood of those who come after us. Let us leave the hard, bright daylight of that and turn toward something with more open sky in it, and more weariness and more mercy, the long dusty road that so many of the young men asleep in this town tonight have ridden in on. Let us follow the cattle and the men who drove them out onto the open trail, and there too we will find that the truth is a great deal harder and a great deal less golden than the legend that was built on top of it. Of all the figures of the Old West, none stands taller in our imagination than the cowboy, free and lean and easy in the saddle, master of the open range, riding the endless golden grass beneath the endless sky, beholden to no man. He is the very emblem of American freedom, printed on 1,000 things, sold back to the whole world as a dream of the unfenced life, and the real young man behind that towering legend, the actual working cowboy of the actual cattle drives, lived a life so hard, so poor, so filthy, and so genuinely dangerous that if you could show it plainly to the boys who grow up worshipping him, it might give them pause. Start with who he actually was. The real cowboy was, overwhelmingly, very young, a boy or a young man in his teens or early 20s, for it was a young man's work and it used young men up and few stayed at it long. He was poor, and he stayed poor. The pay was low, $1 or so a day for months of the hardest and most dangerous labour imaginable, and there was no future in it, no ladder, no savings that survived the first town at trail's end. A great many of them were black men, freedmen, and the sons of the formerly enslaved, who came west because the range offered them work and a rough measure of equality that the rest of the country flatly refused them. Perhaps a quarter or more of all the cowboys on the great drives, a fact the later legend and the movies quietly, thoroughly erased. Many others were Mexican vaqueros, from whom the whole craft and every tool and half the very words of it, the lariat, the rodeo, the chaps, the ranch itself, had been borrowed wholesale. The cowboy of the myth is a lone white hero. The cowboys of the fact were a poor, young, dusty, mixed and largely forgotten crew of labourers, doing brutal work for low wages and going home with nothing. And the work itself, the great cattle drive, the thing the whole legend is built upon, was months of tedium laced through with sudden terror and misery from beginning to end. A drive pushed a herd of thousands of half-wild longhorns hundreds upon hundreds of miles north, from the ranges of Texas to the railheads of Kansas, at the plodding pace of grazing cattle, 10 or 15 miles in a long day, for 2 months and more. And for those 2 months, the cowboys lived out of doors entirely in every weather the plains could throw at them. The blistering sun, the drenching thunderstorms, the hail, the cold, the wind that never once stopped blowing. They slept on the hard ground in their clothes. They did not bathe, not truly, for the whole length of the drive. Weeks upon weeks of the same sweated, filthy, sun-cracked, alkali-dusted skin, and the same crawling clothes, exactly as we spoke of before, for there was no water to spare on the dry trail for anything so frivolous as washing a man. And they ate 3 times a day for 2 months, whatever the trail cook could produce out of the back of the chuck wagon. Beans and salt pork and biscuits and strong coffee and beans and salt pork and biscuits in an endless grinding sameness. The food we have already looked at, weevils and lead-solder and all. The trail cook, by the way, a figure the legend barely bothers to remember, was in cold fact the single most important and most powerful man on the whole drive, after the trail boss himself, paid more than any ordinary hand, courted and feared, because a drive moved on its stomach and a good cook held the whole outfit together. He was very often an older man, or a broken-down former cowboy too stove-up to ride, ruling his chuck wagon like a small tyrant, and no wise young cowhand ever crossed him. And then there was the danger, which was constant and casual and frequently fatal, and nothing at all like the danger of the legend. The cowboy's great enemy was not the outlaw or the duel, it was the work itself. It was the river crossing, the herd forced to swim a swollen, muddy, treacherous river, and the cowboys forced to swim their horses right in among the churning, panicking, horn-tossing animals to keep them moving, and men drowned, pulled under by the current or a thrashing steer or a horse rolling on top of them, drowned at these crossings in numbers that would horrify us. It was the stampede, the whole vast herd, spooked in the black of night by a thunderclap or a wolf or a rattlesnake or simply nothing anyone could ever name, exploding all at once into a mile-wide avalanche of muscle and horn and hoof, and the cowboys, roused from their bedrolls into the dark, galloping blind and headlong across unseen broken ground to get ahead of the leaders and turn them, and a horse that put its foot in a prairie dog hole in that black chaos went down, and the man on it went under the herd, and there was very often simply nothing recognizable left to bury. It was the lightning, out on the flat open plain where a mounted man was the highest thing for miles. It was the endless, grinding, joint-wrecking toil, and the exhaustion, and the cold, and the loneliness. That is the truth beneath the greatest legend of them all. The free and easy master of the plains was a poor and filthy and exhausted boy, very often black or Mexican, and later scrubbed from the story, doing backbreaking and deadly work for $1 a day and no future, eating weevils and drowning at river crossings and sleeping in the mud for 2 hard months, so that men he would never meet could eat beef in cities he would never see. He was tougher than his legend and sadder and realer, and a great deal more worth remembering as he actually was. So let the herd bed down at last on the dark prairie, and the tired boys roll into their blankets on the hard ground with their hats over their faces, 1 or 2 riding slow night herd around the resting cattle, singing low to keep them calm. They have earned their sleep as few people ever have. Let them have it, and let us turn back toward the sleeping town and toward one more corner of ordinary frontier life that the legend never thought worth a single frame, the plain, brutal, endless, unglamorous labour that fell week after week after week upon the women. Let us look quietly at wash day. We have walked tonight through a great many rooms and roads of the Old West, and we have met a great many of its people. But there is one figure we have kept always at the edge of the lamplight, doing the work that made every other thing possible, and scarcely ever thanked or noticed or sung about, the frontier woman. And of all the endless labours that fell upon her, day in and day out, from the dark of the morning to the dark of the night, there was one that stood above the rest as the most dreaded, the most exhausting, the most quietly brutal of the whole week. It even had its fixed and immovable place on the calendar, so that its coming could be braced for like bad weather. Monday was wash day, and wash day on the frontier was very nearly a form of hard penance. To understand it, you must first strip away every single thing that makes laundry an afterthought to us now. The machine, the tap, the powder from the box, the warm water without limit, the whole miraculous ease of it. Take all of that away. Take away, first, the water, which has ever had to be hauled, bucket by heavy bucket, from the well or the creek, and not a little of it, but a very great deal. For washing a family's clothes and linens drank water by the barrel, and it had to be heated, all of it, or most of it, in a great iron kettle or a copper boiler set over a fire that had to be built and fed and tended out of doors or in a sweltering summer kitchen all the long day. And then there was the soap, and the soap is a small horror all its own. There was no gentle bar bought from a shelf. A frontier woman, as often as not, made her own soap, and she made it out of 2 things, the fat saved and rendered from her own kitchen, the grease and the drippings and the scraps hoarded up over weeks, and lye. And the lie she made herself too by pouring water slowly through a barrel of wood ashes saved from the fire and catching what dripped out the bottom. A dark, caustic, biting liquid strong enough to burn. Homemade lye soap did get the clothes clean after its fashion. It was also harsh enough to redden and crack and split and blister the very hands that used it, and the making of it, handling raw lye that could scald the skin and blind an eye if it splashed, was dangerous in itself. A frontier woman's hands, and I want you to picture them, really picture them, were very often a roadmap of all of this, chapped and cracked and reddened and prematurely old, ruined by lye and hot water and hard work before she was 30. And the work itself, the actual doing of the wash, was a full and punishing day of it, and sometimes more. The clothes were rubbed by hand against a ridged washboard, garment by garment, seam by seam, the knuckles worked raw. They were boiled in the great kettle and lifted streaming and scalding and impossibly heavy on the end of a stout stick, a wash stick worn smooth with years, and stirred and lifted again. They were wrung out by hand, twisted hard between two aching arms to force the water out, for there was no wringer and no spin. A basket of wet clothes weighed a very great deal, and every piece had to be wrung and rinsed and wrung again, and then carried out and hung, and in the winter hung to freeze dry, stiff as boards on the line in the bitter air. It broke backs, it ruined hands, it took the whole of a day and left a woman fit for nothing after but to fall into bed. And it came around again, remorselessly, every single Monday of her life, on top of every other thing she also had to do, the cooking and the children and the garden and the milking and the endless rest, work that had no wash day and no Sunday and no end at all until she died. It was so hard, this work, so genuinely and universally dreaded, that taking in other people's washing became one of the very few ways a woman on the frontier could earn money of her own, honest money, in a world that offered her almost no other paid work at all. The washerwoman, very often a widow, with children to feed and no husband's wage, or an immigrant woman, or a black woman shut out of every other kind of employment, took in the laundry of the bachelors and the boarding houses and the better-off families and stood over her steaming kettle and her caustic lye and her ridged board doing, for pay, the single most hated task of the age. It was brutal, and it was low, and it wore women out and old before their time, and it was, for a great many women with no man to keep them, the one thin thread that stood between their children and going hungry. There is something in that drifting off, in the fact that the very hardest, most punishing labour in the whole society was, at the very same time, one of the only doors of independence open to the women who most needed one. They took the worst work there was, gladly, because it was theirs, and it was honest, and it fed their children. There is a terrible dignity in it. So let us be tender, too, with her. The frontier woman with her ruined red hands, straightening her aching back at the end of the long Monday, the last shirt wrung and hung, the grey water carried out and flung across the yard, the great kettle at last gone cold. She is hauled and heated and boiled and scrubbed and wrung and hung from dark to dark. She asked for no legend, and she got none. She simply did the work that let everyone else in this whole long story eat and sleep in something like clean sheets and go out decent into the world. And then she did it again the next week, and the week after that, all the days of her life. Let her sit a moment by the cooling fire. Let her rest her hands. She has more than earned it. There is one last door I must bring you gently to, before we let the whole town go down into the dark together. It is the tenderest and the most frightening of all the rooms of the frontier, and the bravest, the room where the frontier woman faced the greatest and most ordinary danger of her entire life. Again and again, alone. Let us go, softly and quietly, and with the deepest of respect, to the lamplit room where a child is being born. There is a lamp burning, this late night, in an upstairs room of a small frame house at the edge of town, burning low and steady, and it will burn all the night through. And gathered in that room are only women, a midwife, older, calm, her sleeves rolled, who has done this 100 times and lost count of the times it went well, and cannot ever forget the times it did not. A neighbour or two, come to help and to keep the vigil, and on the bed, a young woman, labouring to bring a child into the world. The men are elsewhere, downstairs, or out on the porch in the dark, or simply absent, for this was women's country entirely, and they kept it and ran it and suffered in it among themselves. And what is happening in that lamplit room is at once the most ordinary event in the whole of human life, and the single most dangerous thing this young woman will ever do. She knows it. Every woman in the room knows it. That is why they pray. For childbirth, on the frontier, was the great shadow over every woman's life, and it fell across the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor alike, for there was no medicine, no skill, no amount of money that could truly make it safe. A woman of the frontier might face this room, this lamp, this danger, not once or twice, but 8 times, 10 times, a dozen times across her childbearing years. For families were large, and reliable ways to prevent a child were few and frowned upon, and unreliable besides. And each time, each single time, she walked knowingly up to the edge of her own death and looked over it. They had a word for the whole ordeal that tells you everything about how it was understood. They called childbirth a woman's confinement, and the deepest, oldest meaning underneath that gentle word was the plain grim fact that a great many women went into that confinement and did not come out of it alive. The dangers were many, and against nearly all of them the frontier was helpless. There was the simple physical catastrophe of a birth gone wrong, a child turned the wrong way, a labour that would not progress, a hemorrhage, any of which, in a modern hospital, is a manageable emergency, and any of which, in that lamplit upstairs room 150 years ago, with no surgeon and no transfusion and no true means of intervention, could and did take the life of the mother, or the child, or both together, over a few helpless hours. There was no relief from the pain, none, nothing, for the woman simply bore it, all of it, as women had borne it since the beginning of the world, with a rag to bite and the hands of the other women to grip. And there was the thing that came after, which was in its way the cruelest of all, childbed fever, puerperal fever, an infection of the mother in the days following the birth, carried in, though no one on that frontier yet knew it, on the unwashed hands and instruments of whoever had attended her, the very same invisible killer we have met in every chapter tonight, the germ nobody could see. A woman could come safely through the whole terrible ordeal of the birth itself, could deliver a fine healthy child and hold it and name it and begin to hope, and then, 3 days later, 4 days later, be taken by a raging fever that no one could explain and no one could stop, and die with her new baby in the crook of her arm. It happened, and happened, and happened, and no one understood why, and so no one could prevent it, and it was simply one of the deep sorrows that every family knew, and the midwife, that older, calm, steady woman with her rolled sleeves and her lamp, was, for most frontier women, all the medical help there was, and very often help enough, and more genuinely skilled and more genuinely kind than the rough doctors who might otherwise have come. She was a figure of real standing and real gratitude in her community, called out at any hour, in any weather, riding miles through the night to sit a labouring woman through to her deliverance, and then to stay, and cook, and clean, and mind the other children in the days after. She carried the accumulated wisdom of generations of women in her hands and her memory. But she carried it into a fight she could not always win, against dangers she could not always see, and she knew better than anyone how thin the line was that she walked each time between the joy of a living mother and child and the silence of a covered face. She had washed and dressed too many young mothers for their graves to hold any illusions, and she went out and did it again the next time she was called, because someone had to, and because that was the work, and because a woman in that lamplit room ought never to be alone. So this, in the end, was the deepest and most constant danger of the frontier, and it fell not on the gunfighter or the outlaw, but on the ordinary young wife in the ordinary upstairs room, simply to bring forth life, as women always had, in a world that had not yet learned how to keep them safe while they did it. It is why the graveyards we spoke of earlier hold, beside all those small children's stones, so very many stones for women who died young, died in their 20s and 30s, in their childbearing years, at the very height of their lives. A husband might bury 2 wives, or 3, and marry again each time, not from any hardness of heart, but from the plain arithmetic of a world where women died in childbed, and children needed a mother, and a farm needed a woman to run it. It was ordinary, it was expected, it was braced for, and it was, every single time, a private catastrophe, wept over in that lamplit room by the women who kept the long vigil. Tonight, though, tonight let it go well. Let this be one of the good nights, the nights the midwife lives for. Let the long labour come at last to its end in the small hours, and let there be that thin astonishing cry in the lamplight, and let the young mother be safe and weeping and whole, the child laid warm upon her, the danger past, the dawn not far off. Let the tired women in the room smile at one another over the lamp, and let the men be called up at last from the dark porch, and let there be, in that one small house at the edge of the sleeping frontier town, on this one night, nothing but joy and relief, and the ordinary miracle held safe and breathing in its mother's arms. They did not always get that night. Let us give it to them tonight. They have earned it, all of them, more than we can say. The lamp burns on in the window, but it is a glad lamp now, and all the rest of the town has gone quiet and dark around it. Come, it is very late. Let us walk, one last slow time, down the length of the sleeping street, and see the whole of our little world go finally gently down into the dark. It is very late now, in our little town on the edge of the wide dark world. The deepest part of the night, the part that belongs to no day at all, before or after. The dance out at the hall has long since ended. The fiddler has put his fiddle back in its case, and the young couples have walked home slow beneath the enormous crowd of stars. And Clara, do you remember Clara dressing so carefully by her lamp a few hours and a whole world ago? Clara is home safe, her shawl on its peg, the borrowed beauty washed from her face, asleep and dreaming of the evening, of the music, of a certain young man who did, as it happens, look her way. The paint is off. The danger is years and years down the road. Tonight there is only the good tiredness of a girl who danced. The saloon has poured its last and swept its dreadful floor and turned down its lamps. The piano stands quiet under its cover, and the bright, foul, warm heart of the town has stopped its beating for the night. The gambling hall has folded away its marked cards and its little tiger-painted box, and the last hopeful, ruined players have shuffled out into the dark. The barber has swept the day's hair and worse from his floor and gone up to his bed, his instruments rolled and put away. Elias, the cowhand, the one with the bad tooth, do you remember, from the very start of the morning? Elias is asleep in the boarding house, the raw new gap in his teeth no longer paining him at all, sleeping the deep sleep of a man relieved of a week's agony, and grateful, and healing, one of the lucky ones. The undertaker has drawn his curtain across his lamplit window, and the display behind it waits for morning, and its filing, curious crowd. The medicine wagon is long gone, miles down the dark road by now, its lanterns swinging away toward the next town and the next warm crowd and the next case of bottled hope. Out on the black prairie the great herd is bedded down under the stars, and the tired young cowhands, poor and filthy and far braver than their legend, sleep in their blankets on the hard ground, while one of them rides slow around the edge of the sleeping cattle, singing low and soft to keep them calm, his voice the only human sound for 100 miles. The washerwoman sleeps, her ruined red hands at last still, the great kettle gone cold in the yard, Monday's dread a whole week away. And in the small house at the edge of town the lamp still burns, but it is a glad lamp now, a joyful one, for the child came safely and the young mother sleeps with her new baby breathing warm against her, and the midwife dozes in the chair beside them, keeping her quiet watch, one of the good nights, one of the ones she'll remember. And in a farmhouse just outside of town, Ada, the tired young mother from the very beginning of our long night, Ada is asleep at last, deep and dreamless, her fretful boy quiet and warm in his cradle beside her, his tooth finally through, and the little brown bottle sits capped and quiet on its high shelf beside the coffee, its soft and dangerous work done for the night. She does not know what is in it. She never will. She only knows her child is sleeping, and so for a few blessed hours is she. They are all of them asleep now, or nearly. The barber and the cowhand, the girl and the gambler, the cook with her aching feet and the washerwoman with her aching hands, the young mother and her brand new child, and all the small children of the town drowsing in their crowded lofts. All the ordinary people of one ordinary night, in a world so thick with small and unregarded dangers, in the water and the milk, in the bottle and the tin, in the shared bed and the shared cup, in the loaded gun on its peg and the germ on the helping hand, that it is a genuine wonder, when you truly consider it, that any of them ever woke at all. And yet they did. Most of them. Most mornings. They woke, and they hauled the water, and they lit the fires, and they did the hard and dangerous and unthanked work of staying alive one more day in a hard place. And they loved one another, fiercely and plainly, in the only ways their world allowed, and they built without ever meaning to and without ever seeing it, the softer and safer and kinder world that would one day, long after every one of them was gone, become the world where you lie now, warm and safe and sinking gently towards sleep. There is nothing frightening here now. There never truly was, only distance and difference, and the strange soft trick that time plays on all of us, turning the ordinary comforts and habits of one age into the quiet horrors of the next. 150 years from this very night, someone may look back at us, at all the ordinary things we do and eat and trust and never once think twice about, and shake their head in gentle, pitying disbelief, and wonder however we managed to sleep at all. And they will be right, and they will also be wrong, in exactly the same way that we have been both right and wrong tonight looking back at these people, because they were only ever, every one of them, doing their level best with what little they had in the short lamplit span of time they were given, just exactly as we are, just exactly as we all do. The last window has gone dark now. The single street lies empty and silver under the enormous wheeling prairie sky. The wind moves soft and low through the dry grass at the edge of town, the way it has moved every night since long before there was a town at all. Somewhere far off a coyote calls once into the dark and waits, and is answered, faint and far from somewhere out on the endless grass, and then falls still. The old world is asleep, every soul of it safe in the dark. And so, my friend, should you be. There is nothing left to do. There is nowhere left to go. There is only the warm dark and the soft weight of the blanket, and the long, slow tide of your own breathing carrying you gently out. We have walked, you and I, through a great many strange and unsettling rooms tonight, and down a good many hard and dusty roads. But try, as you drift the last of the way down into sleep, not to think of these people too harshly or too sadly. They were not careless, and they were not cruel, and they were not fools. They were only human beings, doing their honest best with what little they had, in a hard place, a long way from help, reaching out for whatever small comfort lay within their reach. The bottle on the shelf, the bright bottle from the painted wagon, the warm bed even shared, the free lunch even with its flies, just exactly as we all reach, every day, for our own small comforts, never once suspecting which of them the future will look back on and shudder at. Time simply hides our own strange habits from us, gently, the way it hid theirs from them. That is perhaps the kindest thing time does. The street is empty now, the last window has gone dim. Somewhere a dog turns 3 times and settles down into the warm dust, and the wide dark sky wheels slowly and silently overhead, exactly, precisely as it wheeled over every one of them, 150 years ago and more. The same stars, the same quiet, the same soft wind through the same dry grass. There is nothing left to do now but rest. The doors are all shut, the fires are all banked low, the lamps are all gone out, and unlike the good and weary people of our sleepy frontier town, with their shared beds and their poison tonics and their dangers uncounted on every side, you have every comfort of a gentler and a kinder age gathered soft and warm around you tonight. You are safe, you are warm, there is nothing you must do and nowhere you must be, and no hour you must wake to that cannot wait. So let go now of the day behind you and the day ahead. Let go of all of it. Sleep well, my friend, wherever in the world you are, and whatever the hour where you're listening. Rest easy. I'll be right here again, in the quiet, whenever you're ready to come back. Good night.